The crushing of Axis forces in North Africa was only the beginning. As the Allies mounted a victory parade in Tunisia, planning had already begun for a new campaign in the region: the invasion of Italy. The Allies had been divided over their next move against the Axis.
The American approach to strategy was very similar to their approach to business. Their overwhelming consideration was how to get the war over quickly so as to minimize the number of American casualties. And that was the way they thought. The fastest way to win the war, as far as they were concerned, was the direct route across the English Channel from Britain into France and so on to Berlin. And that seemed to them the logical strategy for which they pressed from their first involvement in the war. The British were very much more aware of the problems of mounting any such cross-channel attack and the penalties should it go wrong. The British were also much more concerned with the fate of Europe after the war. For centuries, the Germans and the Russians had contested control of Eastern Europe. Now the Western Allies were committed to the total defeat of Germany. That was the significance of the Casablanca Conference. At the end of it, the British and the Americans made what was called the Casablanca Declaration, announcing that they would accept no terms from Germany except unconditional surrender. But that meant inevitably that the Soviet Union would dominate Eastern Europe, and Churchill and the British were deeply concerned about that. Hence, the British proposal for an alternative strategy, to land first of all in Italy and then at the head of the Adriatic. Churchill, in one of his least appropriate phrases, called this the soft underbelly of Europe. In fact, it's anything but. It's the Alpine Redoubt, extremely hard country to fight through. But the idea was, by coming up from the south, to get to Vienna, to Prague, before the Soviet Union's forces, to try and hold the Russians as far east as possible to avoid their domination of Europe after the war. To the Americans, this made no sense at all. It seemed to them a risky strategy. It seemed a strategy of benefit only to the British, which could only result in more American casualties. Moreover, privately at least, the Americans considered that this strategy was based more on emotion and the British experience of the First World War. That Churchill wanted to show that his ideas for the Gallipoli landings of 1915 had been sound, and, as one British general put it to the Americans when discussing a possible campaign in France, "You are fighting the ghosts of the Somme." The Somme campaign of 1916, the other major campaigns of the First World War, had weighed very heavily on the British, and they were deep in the thought processes of the British as they considered this strategy.
Churchill won the argument, and the first target for invasion had to be decided. Corsica was an option, but the decision was eventually taken to invade Sicily.
This would give them a base for aircraft and for naval forces to be able to threaten further landings in the south of France, in Italy, even in Yugoslavia. So there was nothing wrong with that as a preliminary to a later change in strategy. Also, it was going to provide valuable experience in Allied cooperation and coordination and in the very difficult business of mounting amphibious assaults.
The Allies tried to convince the Germans that Corsica was the target. Elaborate deception plans were put in place, which had some measure of success. Meanwhile, forces were gathering for the forthcoming invasion codenamed Operation Husky. But first, the Mediterranean had to be made safe for the forthcoming armada. Two islands, Pantelleria and Lampedusa, had to be taken first.
Malta, the George Cross Island, stood up to thousands of heavy and concentrated attacks from the air. The Axis thought they could break Malta's spirit and cut it off from supplies. The Axis thought that with the reduction of Malta, they would finally cut the Mediterranean in two. Terrible damage was done, terrible hardship inflicted. Heavy losses were incurred in lives and ships. But Malta held on, and Malta was kept supplied. A map will show the significance of the island fortress, the importance of Malta's victory, and now the story is reversed. Pantelleria, Italy's Malta, and Lampedusa come into the picture, and they have not been able to hold on. It was a combined attack by the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the United States Air Force, and it proved more than the Italians could take. Closing the island, while aircraft formations were also going into the attack, the warship steamed at speed into striking range and struck. Shells tore into the Italian defenses while bombs hurtled down by the ton. The climax of a new experiment, the taking of a strongly fortified island by air-sea forces. And it succeeded. The vast clouds of smoke above the island told the story of the overwhelming assault. 5 days of scientific bombing and 3 days of pounding by the ships brought the story virtually to an end. The infantry force was ready to round off the story. That's part of it, standing by in various types of landing craft. And when they went ashore, covered by the guns of the Royal Navy and a moving barrage of bombs, they landed almost unopposed. Pantelleria, and a few hours later Lampedusa, eventually offered unconditional surrender.
The bombing had numbed the defenders into submission, and the Allied soldiers that landed had very little to do.
Prisoners at once began to give themselves up, marching behind white flags, and only too glad to do so. Our troops had plenty to do, such as mopping up among the ruins. And they lent a hand in looking after those civilians who had not been evacuated. They came from their dugouts looking quite a bit shell-shocked, as well they might. All this time, stragglers from the enemy forces kept coming in to surrender. They took the greatest care to make their intentions clear, too. Anything white was obviously at a premium. Evidently, they regarded the actual surrendering as rather a tricky business. But once they'd succeeded, their worried expressions changed to smiles. Apparently, they feel much safer under the Union Jack.
The capture of the islands gave Allied shipping an almost clear route through the Mediterranean. There were to be 26 landing beaches on Sicily, spread over 105 miles. General Montgomery thought that the Italian defenders would put up a fight for their home territory, and the terrain of the island certainly favored the defenders. Air attacks preceded the landings.
Palermo, on the northern coast of Sicily, has recently been one of the Allies' favorite targets. United States airmen have given the port a very thorough doing in their flying fortresses. The newsreel cameraman who went on this raid recorded strings of heavy bombs falling on shipping in the harbor. The attack was by no means unopposed, and a number of the big aircraft came home badly shot up. That one has lost the tail gunner's cockpit. The gunner himself fell out, but his parachute was seen to open, and he landed in the sea close to Palermo. Back at their base, the fort show what they had to go through to get the splendid results achieved. another attack by flying fortresses, this time on Marsala, the important base on the west coast of Sicily. The targets were situated in the town itself and in the docks, and by the time the cameraman arrived, there was already plenty of evidence of the good work done by the leading aircraft. Clouds of smoke obscured large parts of the target area, which was already undergoing a heavy blitz. Marsala had plenty more to come. This is something the Italians didn't anticipate when they strutted into the European battleground in 1940. All they expected then was a share of the loot. Now the whole of their empire has gone, and they themselves cannot hope to escape. They can't even defend themselves in the air. And after Tunisia, their faith in Germany's power to defend them must be pretty badly shaken. Just as the taking of Pantelleria was a necessary prelude to the next invasion, so the capture of Sicily is itself a prelude to still greater operations. However the fortunes of war may go, the opening of the invasion went according to plan. Aircraft from Malta, only about 60 miles away, played an important part in that plan, of course. Fighters and fighter bombers took off from that much-bombed island for the attack, to harry the enemy and provide an air umbrella.
Convoys carrying the invasion troops sailed from North Africa and as far afield as Scotland. The resultant armada of ships and landing craft would be greater in scale than the first wave of landings in Normandy. At 2:45 a.m. on the 10th of July 1943, Operation Husky began. Some 2,500 ships containing 180,000 troops sailed towards the landing beaches, the largest seaborne operation in history.
I cannot go farther today than to say that it is very probable there will be heavy fighting in the Mediterranean and elsewhere before the leaves of autumn fall.
The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces under the supreme command of General Eisenhower has already initiated the beginning of that heavy fighting.
Bad weather initially hampered the landings, but as the landing craft reached the beaches, very little resistance was encountered.
All this time, the Royal Navy's guns had been pouring shells into the coast defenses, silencing enemy batteries and covering the landings. The landings were by no means unopposed, even if the option was less than expected. Shore batteries shelled the invaders, and a supply ship received a direct hit. The right flank of the 100-mile invasion line was in the care of the 8th Army, men from the United Kingdom, men of the most famous fighting force in the world. They too carried all before them, establishing a primary bridgehead and speedily consolidating. When Graham Thompson arrived on the scene, men and equipment were coming along in a steady flow. The shores of southeastern Sicily had been cleared, and more stuff was being landed.
Airborne operations did not go as well. The transports and gliders ran into high winds and were blown off course. Many of the resultant drops and landings were way off target.
History had been made, and incidentally a historic film record of it taken. There was even a moment to spare to take a shot of a few of the boys typifying the spirit of victory on the shores of Sicily. Already the coastal defenses had been overrun, and it was now a question of keeping stuff pouring into Sicily in a steady stream. Where rocks kept the ships a little way offshore, the boys could just about make it without swimming. The vehicles, too, came along under their own power as regularly and as smoothly as if the whole show was a big practice maneuver.
Wave after wave of troops waded ashore as the invading force grew in numbers. They began moving inland almost immediately.
The Allied forces moved inland, blotting out all opposition and securing captured territory at every stage. Digging in against possible counterattacks, mopping up snipers and isolated enemy outposts. It was reported that they gave us quite a bit of trouble. The first phase took the 8th Army up to Avola, Rosolini and Syracuse. And this film, which reached us some 10 days later, shows the occupation of those places. First, Avola. The Union Jack is hoisted from a high building in the main street. Not much damage appears to have been done to the town, probably because it was taken so quickly. Here, the 8th Army fell in with some American airborne troops, so they were able to compare notes. The Americans, who appeared to be in excellent form, were obviously making full use of local transport. As they were moving back after a happy landing near the town, they passed the memorial of the last war. That war in which the Italians chose the right side and the just cause.
The lack of any determined opposition spurred on the commanders. Monty himself seemed caught up in the euphoria, urging his troops to push further inland. The planners had expected some 10,000 casualties in the first week, but only 15% of that number were actually received. A useful means of transport was the American ducks.
Ducks, those American amphibians which proved so successful during the initial landings, have proved their worth on many occasions since. Each one is capable of carrying a load of 2 tons, and the time saved on transshipment is invaluable. Permanent landing facilities are scarce and usually not in a fit state for immediate use, but as our troops move up towards Messina, the supply ships and the ducks are never far behind. Straight from ship to beach and then on by road to our advanced dumps. Yes, the ducks are playing a vital part in the smooth working of our supply organization.
Three days after the landings, the whole of southeastern Sicily was in the hands of the Allies. German attacks were largely ineffective. Prisoners streamed past the advancing Allied troops, many of them looking relieved that their war was over. On the night of the 13th of July, 1st Parachute Brigade was dropped to capture the Primacell Bridge. This was vital for the advance towards Catania. They suffered heavy casualties, but the bridge was taken.
Approaching Rosolini, a little way southwest of Avola, where the Italians had hung out the usual Italian washing. As in Tunisia, they set it with sheets and things. The population seemed quite friendly and provided wine for the troops, who were only too glad of it. Fighting in Sicily in July is pretty thirsty work. And the troops gave away some of their chocolate ration, something the Sicilians hadn't tasted for a long time. Among the signs of battle were some enemy tanks which provided ample confirmation of the fact that there was every reason to bomb the Renault works when we did. Prisoners in Syracuse the morning after. Wait till Mussolini hears about this. But, signor, now I am on your side. Most of the Italians seemed to be glad to be out of the war. Anyway, they looked the same as most Italian prisoners have looked ever since Alamein. As they went aboard the landing craft on their way to Tunisia, one can imagine them saying the Italian equivalent of "any more for the Skylark." The foundations of victory in Sicily had been securely laid. Once more, the Allies were in full pursuit of the Axis, and this time on Axis territory.
The speed of the advance was hindered by a lack of transportation. The bulk of the transport was due to arrive with the follow-up convoys. Assault vehicles had been given priority. The infantrymen were marching fully laden in the heat of a Sicilian July. Any form of transport was requisitioned to aid the exhausted men.
AMG, the Allied military government of occupied territory, followed swiftly on the heels of our advancing troops. One of its tasks was the suppression of Axis propaganda. There, for example, is a typical enemy poster, John Bull as a repulsive octopus, its tentacles grasping the world. In its place goes Winston Churchill and a message to the Sicilians. And, of course, the clearing out of fascist party leaders was a prime job for AMG. After every town was captured, leading fascists were rounded up. Incidentally, let's hope that the ex-leader of all fascists will himself be rounded up in due course. Here's a shot of a German traitor, Fritzi the dog, He's attached himself to our military police ever since the advance through the desert. The only attractive traitor in existence.
Meanwhile, the Axis troops had been following plans for a steady evacuation of the island across the Straits of Messina. The defense of Sicily was not a priority, and the Axis troops would soon be needed on the mainland. As the soldiers of the 7th and 8th Armies pressed forward, liberated Sicilians would cheer them in the streets. However, snipers still posed a threat in some towns. The German forces on the island, under General Hubei, formed a defensive line across the island from Catania in the east to San Stefano in the west. This would aid the withdrawal of the Axis troops. 8th Army were ordered to move on Catania, and 7th Army were to move north to pierce the defensive line. Reinforcements were arriving on the beachheads to shore up the attack. The town of Centuripe was perched on top of a hill, and it was the key to the push forward. 78th Division were charged with the capture of Cherry Ripe, as the soldiers christened it. The town was defended by soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division, as well as Fallschirmjäger troops. Their ferocious defense of the town beat off a number of attacks, despite heavy bombing and shelling by the Allies. The assaults on the town degenerated into piecemeal attacks by separate platoons and even sections. As the Allies pushed up the hill, bitter fighting erupted on the outskirts of the town. House-to-house fighting ensued, and the town eventually fell. An attack on Catania across the plains would have been too costly. So the Allies would move round the north of Mount Etna to attack the enemy from behind.
The generals conferred just before our final drive on the Etna position. Alexander, Montgomery, and Patton planning the elimination of the Germans from their strong defensive lines.
The terrain was dry and mountainous. The difficulties the troops faced were to be a foretaste of trouble to come. The dust was dried by the Mediterranean sun. Volcanic dust still remained from distant eruptions of Mount Etna. Soldiers became coated with this dust as it mixed with their sweat to form an ashen goo. As the Germans fell back, they continued with their delaying actions, booby traps, mines, snipers, any device they could lay their hands on to hinder the advancing troops.
The fate of Catania was certain when General Montgomery's big attack was launched. The Germans were forced to fall back along the coast road towards Messina, and yet another milestone in the Battle of Sicily was passed. Without a shot being fired, men of the 8th entered Catania, or what was left of it, early on the morning of the 5th of August. The effectiveness of the Allied air attacks was clear to see. Catania had been battered by day and night for weeks on end, and just what it must have been like for the Germans can easily be imagined. The marshalling yards were a shambles. Not many supplies can reach the defenders by rail. Combined operations, in the widest sense, are certainly the watchword at the moment, just as they were throughout the Sicilian campaign. The Navy's part, for example, was not only the transport of the forces, but also the bombardment of shore positions. Cruisers stood right in near Acireale and let them have it, in broad daylight and into the night.
On the 16th of August, the first troops reached the town of Messina.
Americans were actually first in Messina, but men of the 8th Army were only beaten by a very short head, and cameramen were evidently well up in the race too. They found a bunch of civilians huddled near the entrance to the now famous tunnel shelter, waiting for the next air raid. As a matter of fact, thousands of people had been virtually living there throughout our bombardment of the city. Old Glory was hoisted at the municipal buildings. And down at the harbour, the Italian admiral's flag, what was left of it, was hauled down and an excellent substitution made. To all intents and purposes, Messina was a dead town after the great damage done to it. Witness the scene at the dock railhead. And the Sicilian ferry terminus. Yes, the harbour installations had been thoroughly dealt with. Shipping, too. This is one of the German evacuation beaches. Goebbels would no doubt call it a victory beach. Joy through defeat, in fact.
Operation Husky had succeeded in just 38 days. Now, across the narrow straits of Messina, loomed the next objective, the mainland of Italy and the Allies' first landings on continental Europe. Bombing of northern Italian industrial cities also took place.
There's a pretty bleak prospect facing Italy, too. While British troops and their allies knock out Axis armies in the Mediterranean theatre, smashing blows are also being struck by the Royal Air Force. Just as an example, take a recent raid on Genoa. Britain's heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, delivering the fourth hammering in 3 weeks on the great seaport and supply base. The war's being brought home to Italy with a vengeance. It was the second successive night of heavy bombing of Genoa, and wave after wave of our aircraft unloaded incendiaries and high explosives on what Mussolini himself described as the maritime lungs of Italy. All the hard work of our factories in the production of these mighty aircraft and the bombs they carry, all the hard training, the matchless skill and courage of our bomber crews are now reaping their reward in outstanding success on Italian targets. On this particular raid, great damage was done. Damage swiftly followed up until Genoa was virtually out of action. And on this particular occasion, an RAF cameraman recorded this picture of Genoa rocking and blazing under the shattering strokes of Bomber Command. This is what it looks like from the bomber's point of view. The target area clearly lit up by flares and fine weather giving an uninterrupted view of streets, railway, river and buildings. Now, slowing up the picture, we can examine it rather more closely. big round lights are flares. On the right, bombs going down. Everywhere, fires burning, intermingled with incendiaries and HE bursting. On the left, bridges over the river Bisagno. Flying southwest, we cross the railway line. That semicircular building, top right, is 300 yards long. Fires and flares make it almost as bright as day. On the left, a stick of incendiaries bursts near the Via Palestro. That's flak coming up. Next, the inner harbour can be identified towards the right, low down. A semicircle of docks. We fly out over the sea. Turning to come in for another run. Fierce fires burning among the warehouses behind the docks. As the Lancaster leaves the burning city, still more bombs can be seen bursting. Two searchlights flash up into the sky and a stream of incendiary flak goes up. Finally, let's see it again at the actual speed. The bombing of Italy has also begun, as we know, by our American allies as well as by ourselves. Recently, raids were carried out from a Middle East base with liberators on the job and Naples the target. It's not just a nice little hop across the Mediterranean and back. As a matter of fact, the total distance to be flown is actually more than the distance across the North Atlantic. Obviously, fighters and flak are likely to be encountered over a great deal of the route when approaching or leaving the target, and the bombers fly high to deliver their messages to Mussolini and the Italian goats who follow him. And here go the bombs, right down on the docks and the quays and the shipping. High-altitude precision bombing, an American speciality.
The Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922. He had ruled Italy with an iron fist. Known as Il Duce, his fascist party had succeeded in improving the Italian economy and restoring prestige to his country.
200,000 fascists assemble at the Palazzo Venezia on the 16th anniversary of the founding of the fascist regime. Mussolini, the idol of the multitude, chooses the occasion to proclaim that Italy is prepared for any eventuality, that Italy is strong both in spirit and in arms. The cheering of the great crowd interrupts Il Duce, whose forceful speech referring to the critical situation in Europe evokes a solid expression of approval from the black-shot rank and file on their great day. great Mussolini marches at the head of his staff to review the Italian Air Force in Rome. It is the 12th anniversary of the founding of the fascist Air Department, a day devoted to military aviation and to just pride in the magnificent force that Italy has created. Il Duce stands on the tribune and observes the efficiency of the service he has built up. And the squadrons fly over in formation, dipping in salute, units from one of the finest air forces in Europe.
By the time Hitler came to power in Germany, Mussolini had been ruling Italy for some 11 years. The two men shared many ideologies. They had both supported Generalissimo Franco in the Spanish Civil War and had sent troops and supplies to aid the fascists. In the years leading up to the start of war, Mussolini had talked of peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to take this opportunity of addressing the English-speaking public to the medium of one of the most marvelous discoveries of modern times. I will speak to you in a few clear words of the chief problem which interests the whole of mankind, namely, peace or war. As the Prime Minister, the Italian government, and head of the fascist movement, which has been ruling Italy these 9 years, and as a man, I wish to reject and repudiate all the futile chatter and information of those people who pretend to know that Italy wants to prepare for war. I fought in the war as a private soldier, among soldiers. I know what war means. With this double experience, how can anyone think that I should look without horror upon the eventuality of a war? Or nowadays, should it even break out between two nations alone, would fatally become universal.
But as soon as it became apparent that the Germans were about to win the Battle of France, Il Duce wanted a share of the spoils. So he too declared war on France. Mussolini had not expected the war to continue, and the following years showed the deficiencies in his armed forces. Despite attempting to expand his empire into Africa, the Italians and their Axis partners had been roundly beaten on the continent. Now, with the invasion of Sicily, Mussolini's days were numbered. The outskirts of Rome had been bombed by the Allies, and the Italian people were ever more resentful of Mussolini for bringing them into the war. Mussolini pleaded with Hitler for a settlement against the Russians in order to divert troops to the defense of Italy, but to no avail. On the 24th of July, his own fascist Italian Grand Council demanded his immediate resignation. The following day, King Emmanuel demanded the same. Mussolini finally accepted his fate and resigned after 21 years in power. He was immediately put under house arrest by the new regime. All of Italy celebrated. They thought they were finally free of the fascists. However, there was still the matter of their former allies, the Nazis.
The possibility opened up of an Italian surrender if the Allies invaded Italy. And for obvious political reasons, that was too good an opportunity to turn down. So what had been meant merely as a holding operation, the invasion of Sicily to secure the Allied position in the Mediterranean, suddenly became the preliminary to the idea of a major campaign to invade Italy. The difficulty was that the priority was now firmly the Normandy landings set for June 1944, and that very soon after any planned beginnings of a campaign in Italy, all resources, troops, would need to be withdrawn. If a campaign was to be mounted in Italy at all, it would have to be a secondary operation. It would not get priorities for equipment. It would not get the best backing of the respective countries.
The new Prime Minister Badoglio immediately started covertly seeking a peace deal with the Allies. However, the Italians wanted guarantees that the Allies would protect Rome from occupation by the Germans. The Allies demanded an unconditional surrender. The Italians, fearful of German retaliation, did not agree immediately. However, at this point, General Montgomery landed 2 divisions of 8th Army on the shores of Italy. The run-up to the invasion of mainland Italy had been preceded by heavy bombing of the landing areas. Communications and troop concentrations were targeted in raids by bombers and ground attack aircraft.
The war in the Mediterranean saw no lull in the air between the end of the Sicilian campaign and the invasion of Italy. Our aircraft continued the bombardment of the toe of Italy, while strategic attacks were being made further up the peninsula, notably in recent days at the Brenner Pass. Our picture shows action by Baltimore's against targets in the toe of the Italian boot. Softening up, they call it, in preparation for the troops to go right in.
As Montgomery visited his troops, ports and harbors on Sicily were filled with ships loading their cargoes of troops, weapons, and supplies. On the 3rd of September, 1943, Montgomery's 8th Army crossed the narrow straits of Messina and landed at Reggio in Calabria, in the toe of Italy. As in Sicily, they were met only by token resistance. The Italians were forced to sign an unconditional surrender, the first major Axis power to capitulate. It was agreed that the surrender would be kept secret until the 8th of September. The Allies hoped to confuse the Germans, but the Germans had already planned for this eventuality.
Now, for some time, the Germans in Italy, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had been aware of this possibility. And Kesselring had drawn up an operational plan under the code name Axis for what might happen should the Italians attempt to capitulate. So when the Allied attacks do start, the Germans are not particularly interested in resisting them. They are much more concerned about neutralizing the Italian threat, disarming the Italians, getting them out of the way, and in effect turning themselves into an army of occupation for northern Italy.
These, by the way, are the first newsreel pictures of men of the 8th Army landing on the continent of Europe at Reggio. As we've seen, the 8th Army had come a long way, but with their allies, they'd knocked Italy out of the war. To them goes the honor of achieving the first unconditional surrender by an Axis power.
The Italian fleet managed to avoid a German plan to scuttle their ships, and they steamed towards Malta to surrender.
The Royal Navy leads them in. The bulk of the Italian fleet got away and surrendered according to the terms of the armistice. After the loss of the Roma, sunk by German bombs, the Italians rendezvoused the Royal Naval Escort and steamed towards Malta. Warspite, Valiant and British destroyers heading the line. The rendezvous was at 9:30 on the morning of the 10th of September, and these pictures of the surrender taken by the RAF show the ships nearing the George Cross Island. The Italian warships had been ordered to fly a black pennant for easy recognition, as well as their own ensign. It wasn't long before the Italian Admiral Zara came ashore to report to our CNC. Honorable treatment was accorded, of course, and Zara saluted everybody as often as possible. But what a moment for Admiral of the Fleet Sir Andrew Cunningham. Nothing but surrender such as this could fully mark Britain's total naval victory in the Mediterranean. It was a moment that very few admirals can have experienced in the whole history of naval warfare. By now, of course, the rest of the Italian fleet had arrived. Some had come from Spezia, others from Taranto, and, well, there they were. Newsreel cameramen were soon out for a closer inspection. The Andrea Doria, an elderly battleship of the Cavour class, but modernized, 23,000 tons with 10 12.6-inch guns. And a sister ship, the Caio Duilio.
The Fifth Army landed at Salerno on September the 9th. They met much heavier resistance from the Germans. Luftwaffe attacked Allied shipping in the Gulf of Salerno. But the Allies managed to push inland. After 9 days of fierce fighting, the German troops were in retreat. Not all the way up the peninsula, as first thought, but to a new defensive line in the northern Apennine Mountains.
The Germans might easily have conceded the whole of southern Italy, all the way up to Rome and beyond, had it not been for the Salerno landings. The Allies had great difficulty at Salerno. They had to land on either side of a major river estuary, which made coordination difficult. And generally the Germans were so encouraged by the success they had in holding the Salerno landings for some time, that they began to argue that a defence of Italy further south was practical. And the further south they could hold the Allies, the more reduced the threat not only to Germany itself, but also to the German occupation of southern France, and also to the German occupation of Yugoslavia, which was critical not in itself, but to maintain German supply routes from Romania, which was a main source of oil. The Germans kept a number of divisions in Yugoslavia throughout the war until late on in 1944, principally to defend against the possibility of an amphibious landing coming from Italy, which shows that they at least took the soft underbelly strategy reasonably seriously.
The Fleet Air Arm played a notably important part in the assault on the west coast of Italy, where fighter cover was supplied by aircraft carriers as well as from shore bases. Sea fires are seen at work during this operation. Landing on makes an amazing picture of arrival at high speed, followed by the action of the powerful arrestor gear. Every time a plane comes in must be a pretty tense moment for everyone concerned. Naturally, some landings on are smoother than others, and naturally accidents do occur. This sea fire has a fractured oil pipe, and oil on the windscreen is obscuring the view of the pilot. A pretty skillful job in the circumstances. Some damage, yes, but nothing that can't be repaired. The beaches were still under fire, but the job went steadily ahead, and the British and Americans pressed inland on the heels of the Germans, who were withdrawing according to plan, of course, in spite of all their boasts about another Dunkirk. The Battle of Salerno was rapidly being transformed into the Battle of Naples as our forces advanced east and northeast, and prisoners kept coming in, Germans at the double. Germans who look as if they still haven't learnt their lesson. The greatest handicap in the first phase, lack of airfields, was eventually overcome when the Germans were forced to abandon several, with in this case at least one Focke-Wulf 190 intact. Italian officers were most helpful in indicating the position of mines and booby traps and explaining the best method of de-lousing them. And while the 8th Army moved up the east coast and the centre to threaten the German left flank, the 5th pushed on towards Naples. Towns and villages were taken and occupied, and after our victory at Salerno, the pace began to quicken. Our forces, well equipped with guns and tanks and supplies of every kind, were on the march to Naples. The German plan was to delay. The British and Americans had the unpleasant job of dealing with enemy snipers, a tricky job calling for a cool head and a quick trigger finger. Italian civilians were extremely helpful on all these occasions. Here they're bandaging one of our wounded tank commanders and other casualties. But the German delaying tactics failed in their object of holding up our drive. True, their main body fell back in reasonable order, but the Allies were hot on their heels. We were soon in Pompeii, that ancient city, half destroyed by earthquake in AD 63, overwhelmed by the great eruption of Vesuvius 16 years later, and now a battlefield in 1943. Some of the boys did a self-conducted tour of the ancient ruins. A near miss in the theater. Everywhere they'd had half a chance, the Germans had done their damnedest in the way of demolitions. Any number of bridges had been blown, roads and communications wrecked. As usual, endless work for the REs. Still nearer Naples, the arrival at Torre Denunziata, 14 miles from Naples itself. There was a sort of triumphal entry here. This town at one time divided its energy between manufacturing weapons of war and making macaroni. Now, they just make whoopee. With only a few miles to go, the Fifth Army passed Mount Vesuvius, which is still displaying some signs of agitation, as it has done ever since the violent eruption of 1631.
Meanwhile, Mussolini had been freed from his incarceration by a daring raid by the SS and the Fallschirmjäger. Although Mussolini was old and tired, he was forced by Hitler to head a new fascist government in the occupied north of Italy. The push forward was tough, and the first British units did not reach Naples until the 1st of October. They found the port completely wrecked. The Germans had done their job well.
And they entered Naples ahead of the timetable. "See Naples and die" was the old and rather trite slogan for sightseers. But now the people of Naples, seeing the British and American forces coming in, well, they pretty well went mad. General Clark and the Fifth Army had arrived.
The Germans had been busy in Naples, wrecking the port and setting traps for the advancing Allies.
That was a time bomb in the new post office building in Naples. Newsreel cameraman Eric Barrow happened to be within a few yards of the building at the time, and he promptly reacted by shooting these scenes of the immediate aftermath. The Germans planted time bombs in many places in Naples and elsewhere before they left, and as at the post office, they've caused a number of deaths and many casualties.
Work began immediately on clearing the port. It was a vital landing point for reinforcements and supplies. After only 4 days, the first ships were landing supplies at Naples. Beyond Naples, the Allies were now faced with crossing the Volturno River. The weather had worsened, and heavy rains had swollen the river.
"We are in process of taking the whole of Italy," General Alexander is reported to have said, "and it's a slow process." With the roads mined and the bridges across the rivers blown up, the Fifth Army has still been making good progress. Beyond Naples, the River Volturno forms a natural obstacle, and of course the Germans made a thorough job of destroying the bridges. But the 5th crossed the Volturno, and this is the story of how they did it. The first elements went over in infantry assault boats by night, but more were still going over in daylight. They formed the first bridgehead, establishing themselves in positions on the northern bank, driving the enemy back and clearing the way for engineers, British and American, to throw bridges across the river under cover of gunfire and smoke screens. Bulldozers were invaluable, as usual, clearing a good track up from the river bank. The whole job went like clockwork, and all the time bridges were being constructed, troops were constantly being ferried over to the other side. It wasn't long, in fact, before the first German prisoners from north of the Volturno were being ferried back. But the real thing was the bridging, and when a Husky bridge was well and truly completed, infantry and vehicles of every kind went over in a steady stream.
The Americans managed to cross with little resistance, but the British divisions had a harder time of it. Thick mud bogged down the armor on the banks of the river, and enemy fire was heavy. By October 14th, the Allies had almost complete control of both banks of the river, as the Germans continued their fall back to the Gustav Line. The Germans had natural allies in Italy, the weather and the terrain.
Even before the Second World War, military academy textbooks cited Italy as particularly easy country to defend. It's a relatively thin, narrow peninsula, very mountainous. The rivers flow either to the west or to the east. Anybody attacking from the south is faced with a series of river lines overlooked by mountainous terrain.
It was going to be an infantry war, with much of the terrain unsuitable for tanks and armor. These ridges and mountains would be easy to defend, so the Germans set up a defensive line known as the Gustav Line. Heavy rain would turn the countryside into torrents of mud, and snow would fall as early as October. Allied command had expected a relatively easy passage north. Now they knew that a bitter struggle lay before them.
So the Allies find themselves committed to an advance up the spine of Italy. But at the same time, some of their best commanders, including Eisenhower and Montgomery, are being withdrawn to Britain to help plan the Normandy invasion, taking with them some of their best troops and first claim on resources. The armies that are left behind, US 5th Army under the American General Mark Clark, and British 8th Army, now under the British General Miles Dempsey, form 15th Army Group under the British General Sir Harold Alexander. Now, these are not bad commanders by any means, nor are the troops under them of any way bad or open to criticism. But they are conscious that they no longer have first call on resources.
The worsening weather was now a major factor and would condemn the Allies to a grueling winter, fighting for every inch of ground. Allied command had expected Rome to be liberated before Christmas. This was now a distant dream.
And German casualties were coming back all the time. They received, as always, the same careful and humane treatment accorded by the Allies to all wounded on every front. Lately, heavy rain and that greater obstacle, mud, have done their best to hold up our advance. It's not a question of just blaming the weather. As you can see, it's a fact.
The German infantry was now in high spirits. Their retreat, which had started in North Africa, was now at an end. They had plenty of time to fortify their defenses on the Gustav Line, where they would finally make a determined stand. The Allies had to devise new methods of advancing through this hostile country, as this American newsreel explains.
A topographical map shows how the mountains lie like an endless row of fortresses, each protected by its moat, a river at right angles athwart our line of march. Here, weeks were consumed forcing a single pass, crossing a single river. 100 men often held up 1,000. Let us see on this typical situation how the Germans defended the pass and the methods we used to capture it. Beyond the demolished bridges, the Germans laid minefields and emplaced machine guns and anti-tank guns to cover the minefields and bridgehead. Further back, they built pillboxes and concealed artillery just over the crest of the mountains. To take a position like this, we first had to lay down a tremendous artillery barrage. Behind this, our infantry had to swim the river at night, clear a way through the minefield, and put the machine guns and anti-tank guns out of action. Only then could pontoon bridges be put down and our artillery brought across. Then, as our guns went to work on the pillboxes and on the enemy artillery in the mountains, the infantry captured the pass by working around the enemy's flank, storming the pillboxes from side and rear, and silencing them with grenades and flamethrowers. Much of the time, the going was too steep for vehicles, and muscle and mule took over. Supplies were brought through over precarious trails.
The rains of the winter turned to snow, and the advance became bogged down some 80 miles south of Rome.
Heavy snow one day, then a bit of a thaw to follow. Talk about slush. It certainly provided one more test for that versatile vehicle, the Jeep. Decent roads in this part of Italy aren't very numerous anyway, and a heavy snowfall scarcely helps at all. As a matter of fact, this is the main road leading up to Orsonia, so it has to be kept clear, rain, blow or snow. Supplies must go forward.
By the winter of 1943 to 1944, the broad place of the Italian campaign in the Allied strategy was set. Italy was a secondary theatre. The war could not be won there. It could only be won on the Eastern Front by the Soviet Union and by the campaign in northwest Europe that would begin with the Normandy landings. However, in order to assist both these more important campaigns, the Allies, and particularly the British under Churchill, wanted a continuing offensive on the Italian front. The idea was to attack hard enough to convince the Germans that Italy was critical ground, in order to tie down German forces in Italy. So the troops in Italy were in the very difficult position of having to mount attacks with inadequate resources over extremely difficult terrain, in the knowledge that no decisive results would come from them, but that by holding down German forces and making things difficult for the Germans, they were contributing to the wider war effort. It's the role of troops in a secondary theatre. It's always a very difficult role to carry out.
A story from the Garigliano front, before the Fifth Army's new landings, of course. Mount Petrella in the background, the village in the foreground is in no man's land, and the story is a close-up of artillery action, the shelling of the hamlet of Suio and a bridge across the Garigliano River. Major Price from Crawley, Sussex, and Signaller Cummings of Swansea in the observation post, a bombed mill.
Regimental target. Regimental target. Do so. 362715. 362715.
One of the 5.5 guns. Gunner Kelford of Buckley Chester is the layer.
Regiment ready. Fire.
The firer is Gunner Flynn of Clifton, Bristol. The rest of the gun crew are Sergeant Williams of Stafford, Gunners McNamara of Dalston, Clarkson of Enfield, Whitfield of Burslem, Cooper of Christchurch, Cambridgeshire, Hargreaves of Byfleet, and Signaller Skinner from Edgware. Close-up detail on the Fifth Army front made by Paul Wyand of Movietone, whose camera was 3.5 miles from the village being shelled. Sonia, a story of softening up ahead of our advance. The Allies, holding air supremacy on the Italian front, have been taking full advantage of that asset. But until the Luftwaffe has been totally crushed, it's obviously impossible to keep the enemy completely out of the sky. An air battle was soon in progress, with Allied aircraft driving off the Hun or shooting him down.
The Garigliano and Rapido rivers would have to be crossed, but they were heavily defended. The British and American troops tried in vain for 2 days to advance past the rivers, but fierce enemy resistance meant the attacks were called off.
The idea of a large-scale amphibious operation to try and get round the position by landing troops further north was made less and less likely by the increasing demands on specialist troops and on landing craft by the Normandy landings set for June 1944. However, after a certain amount of dispute and the intervention of Churchill personally, it was agreed that a small-scale landing, a corps in strength, might be made and would be made in January 1944, a short distance north of the Gustav Line positions. The idea was that this landing would be followed shortly afterwards by an attack in the west of the Gustav Line to link up. The place chosen for the amphibious landing was Anzio. Neither of the Allies could spare a complete corps for the operation. 6th American Corps was in fact an amalgam of American and British forces.
American, British and French troops of 6th Corps landed on the beaches of Anzio at 2 a.m. on January the 22nd, 1944. Once again, there was very little resistance, and the potential of a push to Rome was a distinct possibility. Troops managed to advance some 10 miles inland.
Naples was one of the places from which Allied forces sailed on that bold and successful combined operation, the new landings near Anzio, only 30 miles from Rome. This is the first film to reach Britain of that operation, which evidently caught the Germans napping and placed General Kesselring in a most awkward dilemma. When our troops were embarking, he'd already called up reserves to the Cassino front. The Allied timing could hardly have been better. Salerno, scene of such critical fighting when our landings were made there, was now a place of embarkation. What a different scene this time, with scores of ducks about to take to the water, troops going aboard and landing craft putting to sea. The force was transported in ships of many different sizes, from small landing craft to large troop carriers. Everyone was in good heart, and remember, at this time they may well have expected strong opposition to their landing. All of them veterans, with the confidence born of experience and victories already won, they passed some of the time on the voyage north like this. As back to the village they go, there'll be no... As we all know, the ships reached their destination in safety and exactly on time. Organization and planning were beyond praise. Every precaution against attack was taken, and it goes without saying that air support was one of the vital factors of success. Air support and naval support, both were complete and effective. At dawn, the troops and their equipment were landed. At some points, the vessels could come right up to the beach. At others, there was difficulty in getting vehicles ashore through deeper water or over soft sand. As for the Navy, they were, as usual, 100% efficient. Bringing the force up to the landing places precisely on time, they got them ashore without a hitch. Their smoothly efficient work on occasions like this often escapes notice, but it didn't escape the cameramen at the Anzio beaches. General Alexander himself was soon on the spot. With him is Rear Admiral Trowbridge. General Clark was there too, of course. Seeing how everything was going, they must have been feeling highly delighted. As a matter of fact, the day after those shots had been taken, a change in weather took place. Landings were temporarily held up by a fresh wind and rather rough seas, which did a small amount of damage. A good illustration of one factor at least, which may seriously interfere with almost any combined operation. Bad weather, however, didn't last long, and meanwhile, Allied airmen had been at work. Bostons, among other types, flew in over the beaches to bomb the Germans and their communications further inland. Our control of the air was virtually complete. Attacks by the Luftwaffe were beaten off by our fighters, while our Bostons and other aircraft continued to bomb. Down there's the Mussolini Canal, many of its bridges blown up. As the landings continued to go ahead, the beachheads were consolidated and extended with remarkably little interference. One enemy gun shelling incoming landing craft registered a number of misses before it was captured.
The strident tone of the newsreels masked the stalemate that was taking place.
As more and more troops and material came ashore, the push inland towards the line of communications between Rome and Cassino advanced, and first prisoners were already being brought in. The port of Antium in ancient days, showed plenty signs of blitz. Once Nero used to come here to make whoopee, and in more recent times that equally notorious fiddler, Mussolini. But now the Allies were there and well beyond. The operation was a complete success so far. The Germans had been taken by surprise and a big leap forward on the road to Rome had been effected. The first phase was over, but the next phase, involving heavy fighting and many grim days, still lay ahead.
The orders for the American Corps commander were ambiguous. He was ordered to advance on the Alban Hills, not to the Alban Hills, whatever that means. Generally speaking, after the problems at Salerno and the previous experience in Sicily, the emphasis was on caution and waiting for the link-up from the offensive coming from the Gustav line. Well, as it turned out, caution was taken too far. Perhaps an opportunity was there for a breakout from Anzio to reach Rome, but it was never taken. The Anzio beachhead was roped off. It could be reinforced and held from the sea, but there was no possibility of a breakout after the first couple of weeks. And in Winston Churchill's withering phrase, I thought we were throwing a wildcat onto the beach to rip the bowels out of the Boche. Instead, we had a stranded whale.
The morale of the troops was lifted by visiting entertainers.
I should be here in battle dress. You know, when I left England to come and work for Ensign, they said, you'll have to wear a battle dress. I said, well, what's the idea? I mean, after all, I'm an actor, not a soldier. So he said, well, you'll have to wear a battle dress because if you get captured by the Germans, they'll shoot you. I said, if the Germans capture me, they're entitled to shoot me. Good afternoon, rich people. Anyway. First Americans I've seen not riding in a Jeep. Oh, they've all got their own personal Jeeps. Yeah. Same as this one they've given me. Gave it to me instead of a gas mask. Took one look at my face and said, we're awfully sorry, but we've got no gas masks for horses.
A more personal note was struck by messages home in Movietone newsreels.
Personal messages complete with latest portraits sent by newsreel from Italy to Britain. More of the boys out there have now made use of the Movietone microphone to greet their families here at home. The first is a Midlander, Ernie Cole of the RASC, who's been away 1 year.
Hello, Mum and Joan. How are you going, Gun? There I have struck a lucky chance and speaking over a microphone in front of some cameras, and a bit nervous in speaking. Hope you're keeping all right at home. I've only got 20 seconds to speak, so I have to say, Remember me to all at home. Hope you'll keep on fine. So cheerio, goodbye and good luck. Hope to see you soon, Ernie.
And a West Countryman, Danny Ellison, REME, Africa Star, also 2 years away.
Hello, Mum. Hello, Dad. This is Danny speaking. How are you? I'm all right. Your mail is coming through very regular. Hope mine is doing the same. Cheerio. Lots of love. Danny. Hello, Diana. This is Danny speaking. Hope to see you soon. And to do what we've always said we'd want to do. Cheerio. Know my love.
The latest flashes from Anzio show troops moving up to the front. Of course, almost the whole of the area is really the front. As at Salerno, so here at Anzio, close naval support has been invaluable. Indeed, throughout these critical days, all services, British and American, have worked as one. A landing ground constructed early on has enabled Spitfires to refuel on the spot. This has been of the greatest possible assistance in keeping the skies clear of any strong forces of the Luftwaffe over the beachhead, but naturally it's not been possible to prevent all attacks by enemy aircraft. They've been flying a number of sorties by day and by night, doing damage to ammunition dumps and shipping. Critical day, no doubt of that, but our anxiety for the Allied forces locked in this bitter struggle has been somewhat eased by the Premier's recent statement based on confident reports from Generals Wilson and Alexander.
The Germans managed to counterattack and bitter fighting erupted. The Allies were pushed back by Kesselring's troops, mile by mile. Finally, the Allies were left stalled in the Anzio area, having suffered heavy casualties. The focus of attacks would have to be switched once again. The town of Cassino was the anchor point in the Gustav Line. Located halfway between Naples and Rome, it was the gateway to Highway 6, the road to Rome. Overlooking the town was a Benedictine monastery constructed in the 6th century. It had seen its fair share of wars over the last 1400 years because of its strategic importance.
The way through to Rome depended upon taking the Monte Cassino position, both the village at the base of the mountain itself and the actual mountain position, topped by a famous Benedictine monastery, opening the way through into the valley of the river Liri, which again would lead through to Rome and to further advances. But until Monte Cassino was taken, it overlooked completely the Allied positions.
The Allied troops that had been stalled there for the winter had come to dislike its imposing presence.
Given that it would not be until spring 1944 that the weather would improve and that the Allies would have the kind of resources they needed to mount a major offensive, logically, in terms of the Italian campaign itself, they could have spent the winter of 1943-44 on the defensive on the Gustav Line, generally making themselves comfortable. But wider Allied strategy meant that that was not possible. They had to keep attacking. And altogether, 3 major attacks were launched between November 1943 and April 1944 with very little effect whatsoever, under very difficult conditions. There was simply no way that they could succeed against determined German defence. The airmen also tried to make their contribution with Operation Strangle, an attempt to bomb the communications north of the German positions and throughout northern Italy, knocking out bridges, railway lines, hitting transport, trying to deprive the Germans of essential equipment. It was attempted. The results are much disputed. It's doubtful if it made any major contribution, but everything was being tried. In February 1944, the Allies made the decision to bomb Cassino Monastery. The argument at the time was that the Germans were using it as an observation post. There's very little evidence to suggest that there were any German troops in there at all, and frankly the rubble afterwards just made a rather better observation post anyway. If there's an explanation for the bombing of Monte Cassino, it is simply the psychological impact of that great lowering monastery overlooking the Allied positions. One British soldier described it as an evil thing. It just had to be bombed. And the bombing of Cassino is perhaps best interpreted just as an expression of Allied frustration at the difficulties of trying to break through this extraordinarily hard position.
This movie-tone newsreel tries to justify the bombing.
In this worldwide total war, there is no exemption from the possibility of being involved in frontline action. The monastery of Monte Cassino would have escaped if the Germans hadn't used it as a part of their Gustav Line defense system, but it dominated the town of Cassino, 1,700 feet below. It dominated the road to Rome, and the Germans were making full use of it for military purposes. Down below in Cassino, a bitter struggle had been raging for weeks. You don't need to be a military genius to appreciate the advantage to the Germans in their occupation and fortification of Monte Cassino itself and the monastery. It's perfectly true, of course, that the monastery, founded by St. Benedict in the 6th century on the site of the Roman Temple of Apollo, was a building of tremendous historic and material value. It had been a center of culture and learning for hundreds of years. are the very reasons, in fact, why the Allied attack was held up until the last moment. Even then, warning leaflets were conveyed to all the civilians concerned, Benedictine monks and Italians who might be in or near the monastery. This is how the leaflets were conveyed. Our attack had been postponed, warnings had been given, absolute military necessity could permit no further reprieve. So the bombers came over, Mitchells, Marauders and Fortresses. The sensational pictures which follow were taken by Paul Wyand of Movietone and leave no possible doubt as to the thoroughness with which the task was carried out once the decision had been taken. That's only the beginning. You'll notice, of course, how the sound of the bombs follows some time after the explosions, and you'll have noticed the dome at one end of the building. You won't see that again. Obviously, the attack was designed to embrace enemy fortifications on the sides of the hill, as well as the monastery itself. Most of the building, by the way, dates from the 17th century, only one very small section from the original foundation. Germany, of course, has denied that her troops occupied the place before the bombardment. Visual evidence that they were there completely demolishes that story, for many Germans were seen earlier making their getaway. great destruction has been effected. A historic building, and not for the first time, even on this actual site, has been brought to ruin. But no one with a proper sense of values, weighing the importance of a building against the importance of the lives of our men, can do anything but fully endorse this regrettable military necessity.
The town of Cassino itself also came in for heavy punishment.
This is the position, Cassino itself and the hills behind it, Castle Hill, Monastery Hill and the rest, that has been holding up the Allied advance on Rome. Holding it up for many weeks of fierce fighting. And these are the pictures of the recent attempt to gain a decision with the aid of a concentrated bombing attack. Paul Wyand of Movietone was there to record the bombardment, and a number of other newsreel and service cameramen. The terrific attack was opened by several waves of medium bombers which plastered the approaches to the town of Cassino and the town itself. The plan was to try and crush the German defensive position and by reducing the town to rubble, enable infantry and armor to follow up immediately and get through. No doubt about the severity of the attack, and after the medium bombers came the heavies, forts and liberators, in addition to more Mitchells and Marauders, wave after wave of them. Wave after wave came over and unloaded. A very thorough job, during which enemy aircraft left them severely alone. Watching these pictures of the bombardment, you might well think the place would be obliterated. It was, in fact, more or less reduced to rubble. Altogether, something like 2,500 tons of bombs were dropped on a target area of about 1 square mile, not to mention the bombing of communications to the north and northwest.
Every attack on the town by the Allies was met by fierce resistance from the Fallschirmjäger troops left to defend the area. Conditions were likened to the trenches of the First World War. The invading Allied troops were a true multinational force, with forces from Britain, America, Canada, France, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and even Brazil. Other troops from as far as Palestine and Senegal also joined the fighting. Many of these troops suffered in the fighting around Cassino, often cut off from supplies in the freezing cold of the Italian winter. Time and time again, advances were stalled short of their objectives, and casualties were high. The German paratroopers were tenacious in their grip on the area, and 3 major battles failed to take the area for the Allies. The first battle took place in January. By the end of April, they were still no nearer to their objective.
As long as the Germans could hold their ground, although they were consuming ammunition and taking casualties, they were using very little fuel, and they were required to make much less effort than the Allies in trying to break this strong position. That meant that they could hold the Gustav line with relatively fewer troops than the Allies needed to attack it. And the exact cost to benefit gain for the Allies in trying to hold down German troops in North Italy, the whole basis of the Italian strategy, is open to question. It's an extremely hard calculation to make. Arguably, the campaign tied up more Allied resources than it did German, but certainly the Allies had a superiority in resources that made this possible. Given that as long as they were fighting in Italy, the threats were there both to southern France and to Yugoslavia, there's almost a total of 40 German divisions involved in the south of Europe in the Italian campaign. But the Germans could rotate in and out fresh divisions comparatively easily, given the Allied control of the air, in order to maintain their defence.
General Alexander then took over the campaign, and planning began for a 4th battle, codenamed Operation Diadem. This would utilize the 8th Army and the 2nd Polish Corps. The Americans and French under the 5th Army would continue their push out of Anzio and aim to advance across the westward end of the Gustav Line. The Allies tried to deceive the Germans by planning a false amphibious landing near Rome. Kesselring fell for this and ordered 3 of his divisions to move closer to Rome. He also ordered a new line of defense called the Hitler Line to be built 6 miles behind the Gustav Line. On May the 11th, 1944, Diadem started. Artillery pounded the Cassino sector. Units of the 8th pushed forwards, and by the end of the first day had established a bridgehead into the Liri Valley.
Here's a 6-pounder anti-tank gun at work. As you'll see in a moment, its fire was returned. A captured German 75 is turned to good use by New Zealanders who fired a large quantity of ammunition kindly left behind. Finally, the infantry went forward to the assault. Forward to Cassino, in the streets of which such heavy fighting had already taken place. Even now, in spite of the unprecedented air bombardment, the most bitter hand-to-hand fighting was to follow. Somehow, the enemy was still able to fight in Cassino. Whether they'd remained there in deep shelters or had returned after the bombing, they were there, still defending the place with great determination. The town of Cassino had been destroyed, but the Battle of Cassino went on. The end of the story had still to be told.
The town of Cassino was finally taken after months of bitter fighting.
The latest film from the Italian front shows the occupation of Cassino. There, where those soldiers are climbing over the rubble, was once the Hotel Continental, a famous strongpoint in the German defenses of the town. Cassino, the scene of one of the most grim and stubborn battles of the war, was eventually outflanked, captured, and occupied by British troops. Remnants of the enemy garrison were mopped up. Here come a few of the last to surrender. That bloke's a German paratroop. He certainly looks all washed up. And he's followed by one or two more, probably the last Germans to be rounded up in Cassino, the fortress they were not able to hold in spite of a most skillful and resolute defense. The monastery was occupied by Polish troops, what was left of it. The enemy, by using it for military purposes, had compelled the Allies to blast them out by shells and bombs. Now, Polish soldiers inspecting the abbey ruins examine German observation posts and see for themselves how well the enemy had been able to overlook Cassino and the valley beyond. At another point amid the ruins, they find a German mortar position. Ammunition was still there, and they found a German weapon something like the American bazooka. Sheer military necessity caused the smashing of this ancient monastery, but even after all the bombardments, art treasures were discovered undamaged, and mosaics on the walls of a chapel were more or less intact. All the same, by the time the Union Jack and the Polish flag were flying over it, the monastery of Cassino was mostly ruin and rubble, a monument to German ruthlessness and to Allied victory in the battle for Rome. New film dispatches from Italy include pictures of reinforcements landing at Anzio just before the successful offensive was made from the bridgehead. This is part of the largest number of troops ever to arrive there in one day. Not a man or a gun was lost in the operation. As to the offensive itself, everyone knows how well that went, with thrusts in 3 directions. One of these quickly resulted in the occupation of Littoria, where the enemy pulled out in a hurry. The picture shows our troops entering, hot on their heels. Many trophies were found in Littoria, and the advance continued towards Cisterna. On the Cassino front, Piedemonte is shelled by Polish forces. And here are some of the first Poles to enter the town. The captain leads his patrol up an apparently deserted street, while a Tommy gunner gives covering fire. They find a German dugout, and it's still occupied. But in this case, they're no squad. On the contrary, all the fight seems to have gone out of the prisoners taken here. Further along Highway 6, British troops capture Aquino. A platoon charges through the ruins to mop up any resistance. Their job to deal with snipers and rear guards. The town captured, mines are cleared, and more prisoners taken. At every point, as the Allied advance goes on, prisoners keep coming in. Kesselring has been losing thousands of men and tons of equipment. The battle in Italy now is a battle for the liquidation of his army, and good progress towards that end has been made since these pictures were taken on the 25th of May. Back at Anzio, yet more prisoners march away into captivity. And at the beach, they find plenty of accommodation waiting for them. For some of them, no doubt, our landing craft were a bit of an eye-opener. The scene is somewhere between the Anzio bridgehead area and the Fifth Army front. The occasion is the actual link-up of the two forces. British troops from the Anzio front, men from that force which has held its ground so long against every counterattack, meet Americans who have driven through from the south. A great moment, not only for those on the spot, but obviously for the whole Allied cause.
Hi, Yank. I'm from London. I'm from Pennsylvania. You had a good trip?
It was a hard flight, but we did it, though.
Good. I'm sure glad to see you.
Yeah.
It's been tough on the beach, I'll tell you.
It's tough all over, too.
All right.
We're glad to meet you.
We're going to be in Rome in no time.
We're going to be in Rome in 3 days.
Have a good drink up and off.
Among a number of cameramen there to record the link-up was Paul Wyand of Movietone, just getting out of the car. General Clark himself was quickly on the scene, and as we know, the Allied advance following the link-up has forged ahead. After the smashing of the Gustav and Hitler lines, and after this link-up of the armies, the next phase was a race to cut off the retreating enemy, and the number of prisoners taken is mounting daily. Quite a different tale from the old German boasts about their impregnable Italian defenses. In Italy, history is being made as the battle for Rome and the rest of the country is resumed in full force. Pictures just received show troops moving into action on the casino sector of the front. Our story will show British and Indians on the job of cracking through the Gustav line, but of course it's an Allied drive that's now in progress, and terrific work has also been done by the French, the Americans, and the Poles. In the casino sector, before the fall of casino itself, an early success was the crossing of the Gari River, under cover of smoke and the concentrated fire of field guns, howitzers, mortars, and machine guns. A number of machine guns employed in maintaining harassing fire on the famous Highway 6 were firing a burst every 2 minutes, night and day, and used up 340,000 rounds each in 3 days' work. From north to south, the so-called impregnable Gustav line was broken and the advance continued. Already at least one German division has been wiped out and 3 others very severely mauled. Thousands of prisoners have been taken, many of them from among Hitler's crack troops, the parachute men. In spite of outstandingly favorable defensive positions, the Germans in Italy have had to give way. Many have been killed, many have been captured. The rest have retreated to the Adolf Hitler line to make another stand. But as to that, we shall see. A great beginning has been made, and while the battle continues to rage, Allied airmen are playing their important part. By way of example, just look at pictures of the smashing of enemy communications well behind the front by Americans. The smashing of bridges on 2 routes between Florence and Rome. It's over these bridges that enemy supplies and reserves must come down from the north. Looks like a hold-up, doesn't it? These pictures show incidents during the smashing of the much-advertised Gustav line. Smashing is right. Look at what remains of San Angelo, one of the points which the Germans thought would hold against all attacks. But here, British troops broke through the strong defenses, and now the Germans are singing a very different tune, talking of our overwhelming strength in tanks and so on. Castelforte was another German bastion smashed by the onward sweep of Allied forces. Americans of the Fifth Army have taken a great stride forward, pushing on into the Hitler line. And the French. They too have done terrific work. Knocked out German tanks, perhaps the most interesting part of the scenery here, bear witness to the rout of the Boche from his so-called impregnable positions. French triumph was undoubtedly some of the most welcome news of all, heartening for their comrades in France itself and significant to the enemy for the future. Down with the swastika intact. As for the prisoners, they kept coming in, small groups and large batches. Congratulations on being taken prisoner or what? 6,000 and they were still coming in. Here are a few types, accent on youth, I should say. Once again, the Boche is crying camarade in Italy, and that's a notion destined to spread. They have to be de-loused, just as all Europe has to be de-Nazified.
In a very controversial move, the American commander of Fifth Army, Mark Clark, opted to swing the bulk of his forces in the option called Operation Turtle for the liberation of Rome, which the Germans did not defend. He sent only a fraction of his forces north in pursuit of the Germans in Operation Buffalo. The effect of this was that the German forces escaped. They reached their next defensive lines before the forces of Buffalo driving north could seal them off.
The Germans did not want to face the Allies on the rolling plains towards Rome, so they had begun another retreat towards a new defensive line. German troops hastily evacuated Rome before the Allies arrived. The Fifth Army entered Rome on June the 4th. They were greeted by near hysteria from the beleaguered Romans. The first major Axis capital had fallen, and the celebrations began.
Men of the Fifth Army soon made themselves at home. It wasn't long before Scotsmen were showing the Romans what's what in the way of music. People of Rome soon found out quite a lot of things about Scotsmen, all about kilts, for instance. Quite. General Clark and General Alexander reviewed troops, and the CNC, addressing the men afterwards, had a word to say about the significance of the Italian campaign and its relation to the landings in France.
The present battle, which has finished its first phase, has been a magnificent success. As the French would say, une belle victoire. But it is only the beginning of more and future great successes. Before the Western invasion was launched, we hoped to be able to present them with a great victory. And we were just able to do it. We were able to present them with the fact that we'd broken through two very strong defended lines, the Gustav line and the Adolf Hitler line, and incidentally the last and third line, which is the one covering Rome, and smash the German armies in the field and take Rome. And that is the present we gave our brothers in the West just before they set off on their expedition across the Channel.
What do you think about this, fellas? Have you any sisters? Have you any sisters? No sabi inglese?
No.
Come stai?
Bene.
Soldati, positivi, sorelle.
Sorelle?
Forse signore, sorelle? Just a job, lucky George.
2 days later, the fall of Rome would be eclipsed by events in France. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, had begun. The campaign in Italy would now take a back seat to events unfolding in France.
A free Rome assembles in the Piazza San Pietro to receive the Pope's blessing. Rome prays, remembering the dead.
The Germans were building their next defensive line, christened the Gothic Line, in the mountains further north of Rome. Lesser German units were left in the path of the Allies as they surged forward after the liberation of Rome. The advance covered some 270 miles by the start of August.
The latest news from the Italian battlefront is the King's visit, but the latest pictures show the 8th Army occupying Arezzo, 54 miles southeast of Florence. Arezzo, capital of the province of the same name, is perched on a hill, and there was hard fighting before the British troops finally broke through. As you can see, Arezzo got knocked about in the process. New Zealanders, as well as other Empire troops, took part in the attack, which marked another step forward towards the complete occupation of Italy.
On August 4th, the Allies reached Florence, to be met by the now familiar cheering crowds.
The Allied armies in Italy, whose brilliant work has naturally been somewhat overshadowed by great events nearer home, have now reached Florence. Latest pictures show the 8th Army moving in. No one really expected that the Germans would treat Florence as the open city they declared it to be. All the same, masterly work by the Allies under General Alexander had got them out, while at the same time preserving most of the city. First troops in were quick to search for German rearguards and snipers, and Italian patriots were quick to point them out. Views over the city show not only the state of preservation of the buildings, they also show the difficult mountainous country that lies beyond. The Gothic Line, in fact. The Germans had destroyed all the bridges over the Arno except the Ponte Vecchio, and they'd demolished buildings on the approaches to that. Our troops were eagerly welcomed, but the people of Florence had been having a bad time, being short of food and water. Sniping, too, was still going on, and patriots were doing their best to finish off resistance by the enemy, including Italian fascists.
The Italians had suffered under German occupation. Uprising by partisans had been met with cold-hearted reprisals by the Germans. For every German killed by the partisans, dozens of innocent civilians were rounded up and killed. Under the Italian fascists, the Jews had been persecuted, but there had not been the wholesale slaughter that the Germans had wanted. Once the Germans were in occupation, Jews were deported to death camps. However, the Vatican, despite all rumors about collaboration with the Nazis, sheltered many thousands of Jews. By August the 25th, 8th Army had reached the Gothic Line, and by the 29th, the line had been pierced. Kesselring threw in a number of divisions to push back the Allied advance. If the Allies reached the plains of the Po Valley, the war in Italy would be over. Allied troops from the 5th and the 8th still had to cross an endless series of ridges and valleys. They were sustaining heavy casualties, and once again, the weather was worsening.
U.S. Army Signal Corps pictures tell the story of what it's like in sunny Italy today. Rain and mud on the 5th Army front have produced appalling conditions after some of the worst weather ever experienced in this part of the world. In spite of everything, including counterattack, the Allies in Italy have been battling on. As you can see, the going has been very tough indeed, quite apart from stiff resistance by the Hun. The film speaks for itself on the subject of the weather. The town of Borgo San Lorenzo had assumed quite a Venetian appearance following torrential rains and widespread flooding. Civilians were marooned in their houses, and at least one bunch of children enjoyed a thrilling rescue by jeep. All very interesting for Italian civilians, but not so amusing for British and American troops engaged in fighting Germans as well as rain and mud.
The campaign degenerated into a war of attrition, with supplies and reinforcements to both sides being cut off. By October, the Allied offensive was called off and troops dug in for a long winter. The Allies' final major offensive began on the 1st of April 1945. Artillery attacks were supported by massive air raids on German positions. The 8th Army would attack across Lake Comacchio and on across the Senio and Santara rivers.
Pictures of the 8th Army attack on the Senio river line. Marathas, men from central India, are seen moving up to the attack as the Battle of Northern Italy flares up into greater prominence again. And men from the United Kingdom advance against some of the enemy's best troops, strongly dug in among well-fortified positions in good defensive country. But in spite of these factors, good progress has been made by the 8th Army and the 5th as well in the opening phase of the Italian summer offensive. Good progress made and many prisoners taken by men who, though crowded out of the headlines, are most certainly not a forgotten army. The glory of their past victories will never be forgotten while military history is read. And the part they are still destined to play, especially if Hitler hopes to include northern Italy in his so-called redoubt, will imply a campaign of the greatest importance. Already they've done big things at the Senio River, and with all the determination and efficiency for which these veterans are famous. Attacking the Hun, who is said to have at least equal numerical strength out there, beating him back and burning him out. Infantry and flamethrowers in action provided this grim impression of the violent struggle to clear all Italy of Hitler's fanatics.
On April 17th, the British 8th Army took Argenta. This was the gateway to the Ferrara and Po rivers. An attack on Bologna was launched as the final days of the German occupation of Italy unfolded.
pictures taken in Milan and only just released here show the last of the Huns to leave that Italian city. They had quite a send-off too.
Mussolini attempted to reach a peace agreement with the Allies, but as he tried to slip across the border to Switzerland, dressed in German uniform, he and his mistress Clara were captured by Italian partisans and thrown in jail. On April 28th, they were both shot, and their bodies left in the street for Italians to vent their anger on. Il Duce was finally strung up on a lamppost by his feet. An inglorious end to a man who had taken his country into a war the Italian people did not want.
Firemen were called in to disperse the mob, who were by now, well, what shall we say, perhaps a trifle overexcited. The final ghastly scene was the hanging of the bodies upside down outside a petrol station. Well, at least it's a warning to all remaining fascists everywhere.
By now, the Allies were advancing across the Po Valley, and the Germans were in full retreat. Allied aircraft had destroyed all the bridges across the river, cutting off the Germans' main escape route.
Latest pictures show the Allied entry into Bologna, where they received the sort of welcome that is nowadays accorded everywhere when people are freed from Nazi rule. The Allied armies in Italy have contained many elements besides American and British. All have fought superbly in a unique comradeship, but more than half of the total were British, and the majority of that half came from the United Kingdom. Now the glory of the great victory is shared by them all, whatever their nationality, and by their leaders.
The Germans surrendered on the 29th of April 1945. All fighting was to cease by May 2nd. War in Italy was finally over.
It wasn't long after the capture of Bologna that the Allied armies under General Clark, that daring American soldier, as Mr. Churchill has called him, completely crushed the German will to continue the fight. The Supreme Commander, Field Marshal Alexander, has proved beyond all doubt one of the greatest military leaders of this war. In the dark days, he was last to leave France. In Burma, he extricated an army. In the Mediterranean, he has planned and achieved total victory. Prisoners were already being taken in their tens of thousands when the Huns surrendered unconditionally. A surrender involving nearly 1 million German soldiers. Comment on such an event is superfluous. In the royal palace at Caserta, the German delegates, a colonel and a major, came in to sign the surrender wearing mufti. Alexander's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Morgan, addressed them.
I understand that you are prepared to sign terms of surrender on behalf of General von Wietinghoff, Commander-in-Chief Southwest.
Yeah. When it came to signing, the German colonel made a statement about not being able to guarantee that the terms would be accepted by his superiors.
Ich kann diesen aber nicht mit völliger Sicherheit versprechen.
He assumes that his commander-in-chief is going to approve of his action, but he cannot give an absolute assurance to this effect.
We accept those conditions.
Though it would be interesting to know why the Germans were not in uniform,
It was obviously a moment of the greatest satisfaction to the Allied officers watching them sign on the dotted line. After General Morgan had added his signature to the historic documents, the Germans were given 3 copies, one of them in their own language, and the brief proceedings were politely but firmly brought to an end by the General.
Thank you, gentlemen. I ask you to withdraw now.
That was that. Unconditional surrender of nearly 1 million men, signed away by German officers in sports coats.
The Allies committed themselves to a campaign on the Italian mainland without having thought it through in strategic terms. The decision to invade mainland Italy after Sicily was taken for political reasons, very good political reasons, the prospect of getting an Italian surrender. After that, the German decision to defend south of Rome committed the Allies to the Italian campaign itself. After the problems with the Salerno landings, the German decision to defend south of Rome committed the Allies to a major campaign. Whereas in terms of Italy itself, they could simply have gone on to the defensive and sat holding southern Italy. In terms of wider strategy, it was important that they keep attacking through winter 1943 to 44. Although those battles in themselves achieved very little, in the wider picture they were an important part of Allied strategy. The political success in liberating Rome must be offset against the opportunity which most people believed was there to end the campaign in autumn 1944 by trapping the German forces as they tried to retreat. That failure was certainly a missed opportunity, but even if the opportunity had been taken and the German forces in Italy eliminated that early, there was no prospect by then of a continued advance north. Churchill's soft underbelly strategy had finally gone with the Normandy campaign. So to that extent, the opportunity was missed, but it was not of overwhelming strategic importance. The same can be said of the rest of the campaign in Italy through 1944 to 1945 and the final successful break through the Gothic Line. It was a useful contribution to the Allied war effort, but it was never going to be decisive, and the troops that fought it recognised this.
The troops in Italy were laughingly referred to as D-Day Dodgers, but their experiences in the battle for Italy were far harder than the newsreels had made out. Somehow, the Italian campaign has been forgotten in the history of World War II, perhaps because the nature of the battles do not make it an easy campaign to categorize. The men that fought and died in Italy played a vital part in World War II. Often let down by poor planning, their contribution to the victory over fascist tyranny in Europe should never be forgotten.